The chamber went silent before the final vote even finished counting, and I already knew we had lost. I remember the exact sound the chamber made in that silence. It was not the sound of shock. It was the sound of 9 species who already knew the outcome, sitting quietly while the counting finished for the sake of appearances. I had walked into that room an hour earlier believing we still had a chance to argue our case. I walked out of it, knowing the argument had never mattered at all. My name is Daniel Cole, and I was the youngest liaison officer Earth ever sent to the Galactic Council. I was standing at the human delegation table when the lights above 9 different alien seats turned green, and only the light above mine stayed red. 9 votes for, 1 vote against. Ours. The measure was simple in its wording and brutal in its meaning. Earth's home system would lose its charter status. Every right we had earned over 40 years of service, every seat we had fought to keep at that long curved table, was gone in the space of a single announcement. Our resource claims over our own system would now be shared with the Valkyrie Assembly, a species bloc that had never once sent a ship to help us, and had spent the last decade quietly lobbying every other member to see humanity as a problem rather than a partner. I did not stand up, I did not shout. I had been trained for exactly this moment, though no one had ever truly believed it would come. I simply looked across the chamber at Ambassador Thessaline of the Council presiding body, and I watched her avoid my eyes. Around the curved table, the other delegates busied themselves with small, deliberate motions. The Valkyrie representative straightened a set of papers he did not need to straighten. The Orenthi delegation whispered to one another in low tones, careful not to look toward the human seat. Only the Doran ambassador, an old and weathered figure named Vesic, kept his eyes on me the entire time, and there was something like grief in the way he held himself. I thought of my grandfather in that moment, an old man who used to tell me that the worst betrayals never come with warning bells. They come dressed as ordinary procedure, delivered in calm voices, by people who have already decided the outcome, long before they walk into the room. I understood, watching that chamber, exactly what he meant. 40 years. That is how long humanity had been sitting at that table. 40 years since the first council ship arrived at the edge of our solar system and told us, with great ceremony, that we were being welcomed into a community of civilized worlds. We had said yes. We had always said yes. When the Valkyrie border wars broke out, we sent ships. When the Orenthi colonies were struck by a plague their own scientists could not cure, we sent our doctors, and we sent them for free. When 3 separate species could not agree on how to split a mining belt without a small war breaking out, it was human negotiators who sat in the room for 6 months straight until they signed the peace. We never asked for glory. We asked for a seat at the table, and for the promise that we would be treated as equals. That promise had just been broken in front of me, and it had been broken by a vote of 9-1. I thought about the young engineers back home, who had spent their whole careers building the systems that kept half the council's trade routes running smoothly. I thought about the doctors who had spent months away from their families curing a disease that was never ours to solve. None of that history was mentioned in the chamber. None of it appeared anywhere in the official record. It was simply erased, the way a debt is erased when the one who owes it decides they no longer wish to pay. The reasoning given was almost insulting in how thin it was. The official record would say humanity's growth rate was creating instability in trade routes. It would say our expanding colonies were putting pressure on shared resources. It would say nothing about the truth, which every delegate in that chamber understood perfectly well. Humanity had grown too fast, too capable, too useful, and too independent for older species, who had spent centuries assuming their seniority meant permanent authority. We were not a threat because we had done anything wrong. We were a threat because we had done everything right, and we had done it faster than anyone expected. I felt the old ambassador from the Doran Concord lean toward me from 2 seats away. His name was Vesic, and he had always been kind to me in small ways, the way an older colleague might be kind to someone he privately worried was walking into a storm. He did not say he was sorry, he only said one thing, quietly, so the recording devices would not catch it. You should send word home now, Daniel, before the formal notice goes out through official channels. I nodded, because he was right, and because staying seated in that chamber for 1 more second felt like agreeing with what had just happened. I stood, gathered the data slate from the table in front of me, and walked out through the tall doors at the back of the chamber without looking at a single alien delegate. The corridor outside the chamber was long, lined with windows that looked out over the council station and the slow-turning stars beyond it. I had walked that corridor 100 times before, usually with a sense of quiet pride that humanity had earned its place among the stars. This time it felt like walking out of a courtroom after a verdict I still could not believe. My comms officer, a woman named Laura Bennett, was waiting for me at the transport bay. She had been with the delegation for 3 years, long enough to read my face before I said a word. "It happened, didn't it?" she said. I told her everything: the vote, the reasoning, the silence from every delegate who had once called themselves our friends. She listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with every sentence, and when I finished, she did not ask what we were going to do next. She simply opened a secure channel and told me command was already waiting. I sat down at the small terminal in the transport bay, and I typed out the full report myself, because some messages are too important to hand to anyone else. I described the vote. I described the reasoning. I described the way 9 species who had taken everything humanity offered them for 40 years had turned around and stripped us of our place without so much as a private warning. Then I sent it, and I waited. The response came back faster than I expected. Command back on Earth did not send pages of strategy. They did not send a declaration or a demand, or even a request for clarification. They sent a single line, addressed to me personally, meant to be relayed to every human still standing inside that council station. I opened the message, and I read the one word Earth had chosen as its entire answer to the betrayal. Understood. That was all. No anger, no threat, no plea for the council to reconsider. Just a single calm word, sitting alone on the screen, and somehow it felt heavier than any speech could have been. Laura read it over my shoulder and went very still. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole response." "That's the whole response," I told her. I did not fully understand it yet, not in that moment. I only knew that the word had been chosen with purpose, the way every word from command always was, and that somewhere back on Earth, people far more experienced than I was had already decided exactly what would happen next. I looked out through the transport bay window at the alien ships docked along the station, ships that belonged to species who thought they had just won something. I had a feeling, standing there with that single word glowing on my screen, that they had not won anything at all. They had simply started a clock they did not know existed, and none of them had the slightest idea how little time they truly had left. The word sat on my screen for a long time, before I understood why command had chosen it, and not something louder. Any other species facing what we had just faced would have answered with anger. They would have sent demands, or threats, or a formal challenge meant to save face in front of the same delegates who had humiliated them. Earth sent none of that. Earth sent a single word that meant we accepted the situation exactly as it was, without argument, without begging for it to be reversed. To anyone who did not know human history, it must have looked like surrender. To anyone who did know human history, it meant something far colder. I had studied the old records during my training, back when I was still learning what it meant to represent an entire species at a table full of strangers. There was a pattern in how humans had spoken to each other during their darkest conflicts, long before the stars had ever opened up to us. When a side had been wronged beyond any hope of fair negotiation, and had already decided exactly how it intended to respond, it did not waste time arguing with the side that wronged it. It simply said the word that meant the discussion was over, and let its actions speak for whatever came next. Laura understood it the moment she saw my face. "They're not going to ask for anything, are they?" she said. "They already decided what happens next before they even sent this." I nodded slowly. "That's exactly what worries me," I told her. We did not have long to sit with that thought. Within an hour of the vote closing, official notices began appearing across every channel the Council used to communicate with member species. Earth's charter status was formally suspended. Our seats at every joint committee were reassigned. The language was careful and bureaucratic, the kind of language designed to make a betrayal sound like a routine policy adjustment. I read through 3 separate versions of the announcement before Nathan Price, another liaison officer stationed 2 decks below me, came into the transport bay looking like he had aged 5 years since breakfast. "Have you seen what they're calling it?" he asked. "They're calling it a rebalancing of council obligations, like we're a budget line they're trimming." "That's exactly what we are to them right now," I said. Nathan had been with the delegation almost as long as I had, and he had a habit of pacing when he was thinking hard, which he did now, back and forth across the narrow floor of the bay. He kept glancing at the message still glowing on my screen. "One word," he muttered. "Command sent one word and nothing else." "That's not a response, Daniel. That's a signal." He was right, and within a day, the rest of the delegation began to see it too. Grace Hollow, our senior ambassador, called an emergency meeting in the private human section of the station, away from any alien listening devices we knew about, and several we suspected, but had never proven. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had negotiated trade disputes between species who had been shooting at each other only weeks before, and she had done it with a calm voice and a steady hand. When she walked into that meeting, her calm had not broken, but something in her eyes had changed. "We are not fighting this decision," she told us. "Command has made that clear. We are not appealing it, we are not protesting it in the chamber, and we are not going to give a single alien delegate the satisfaction of watching us argue for something they have already decided to take from us." Someone at the back of the room, a young logistics officer named Ethan Marsh, asked the question everyone else was thinking, but too careful to say out loud. "Then what are we doing, ma'am? Because sitting here doing nothing feels like exactly what they want from us." Grace looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "We are not doing nothing," she said. "We are doing exactly what we told them we would do. We told them we understood. Now we act like it." Over the following 2 days, the change became impossible to ignore, even for those of us inside the delegation who thought we understood the plan. Every human ambassador stationed on an outer council world began quietly requesting transport home. Not urgent transport, not the kind that draws attention, but the ordinary, routine kind that fills out a form and waits its turn in the queue. Human contractors working on Valkyrie shipyards finished their current assignments and declined new contracts. Human doctors on Arenthi medical stations began training local staff to take over duties that had been handled exclusively by our people for over a decade. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. That was, I came to realize, exactly the point. I spent those 2 days working the communication desk at the station, relaying reports back and forth between the delegation and command on Earth, and I began to notice something strange in the tone of the messages I was sending home. There was no urgency in them. No requests for reinforcements, no talk of contingency plans in case the council escalated further. Command wanted information, careful and complete, about exactly which human personnel were stationed where, exactly which systems relied on human maintenance, and exactly how quickly those personnel could be recalled without causing visible disruption. I asked Laura once, during a quiet stretch between shifts, whether she thought we were being told the whole plan. "I don't think anyone outside of command knows the whole plan," she said. "I think we're being told exactly enough to do our jobs, and nothing more." That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, I found myself trusting it, the way you trust a decision made by people who have earned that trust through 40 years of careful, patient work. Command had never once acted rashly in all the time I had served. Every treaty humanity signed, every alliance we built, had been the product of long deliberation and quiet preparation. If they were being this careful now, in the face of the worst betrayal our species had faced among the stars, then whatever they had planned was not something built in a single afternoon of anger. It had been building for far longer than that, and none of us on the station yet understood how long. The alien delegates noticed the change too, though at first they seemed to read it as exactly what it was designed to look like. Vesic, the old Doran ambassador who had shown me kindness in the chamber, stopped me in a corridor on the second day and asked, with genuine confusion in his voice, why the human ambassadors seemed to be leaving so quietly. "You have every right to protest," he said. "You have every right to demand an explanation, to bring your case before the wider assembly. Why are your people simply packing their belongings and going home without a single formal complaint?" I told him the truth, or as much of it as I understood myself. "Because we already gave our answer," I said. "We told you we understood." He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, something between confusion and a dawning unease he could not quite name yet. "That word troubles me more than any protest would have," he admitted quietly. "A protest means you still want something from us. Silence means you no longer expect anything from us at all." I did not answer him, because I did not yet have an answer to give. I only nodded, and continued down the corridor toward the transport bay, where another group of human engineers were quietly boarding a shuttle, bound for a rendezvous point outside council space. I watched their faces as they filed past me. None of them looked afraid. None of them looked angry. They looked like people who had been given clear instructions and intended to follow them without hesitation, the same way soldiers move when they trust the ones giving the orders. I did not know yet exactly what command intended to do with all of us once we were gathered back beyond the reach of council authority. I only knew that the calm on every human face I passed that day was not the calm of people who had given up. It was the calm of people who had already decided what came next, and were simply waiting for the rest of the galaxy to catch up to a decision we had made the moment that vote was cast against us. By the end of the first week, the council chamber had grown noticeably restless, and it was not because of anything humanity had said. It was because of everything we had not said. I sat through 3 separate committee sessions that week, where alien delegates raised the topic of humanity's silence, as though it were a puzzle they could not solve. The Velkari representative, a tall and severe figure named Corvain, who had championed the vote against us, seemed particularly bothered by it. He had expected outrage. He had prepared arguments to counter a protest that never came. Instead, he found himself standing in front of an empty human seat, because Grace Hollow had stopped attending sessions that no longer concerned matters humanity had any stake in. "Where is the human delegation today?" he asked the chamber, his voice carrying more irritation than he probably intended. The presiding officer checked her records and informed him that the human delegation had submitted notice they would not be attending unless directly required by treaty obligation. Corvain sat back down without another word, but I watched his expression, and it was not the expression of a man who felt victorious. It was the expression of a man who had expected a fight and instead found himself standing alone in a room, arguing with silence. Command's recall orders continued through that week, with the same quiet, patient rhythm they had begun with. I found myself assigned to help coordinate the return of human personnel from 3 different systems, and the scale of it began to reveal itself to me slowly, one report at a time. There were the shipyard engineers on the Velkari construction platforms, over 200 of them, who had spent the last 6 years building and maintaining vessels that the Velkari fleet depended on for basic operations. There were the medical teams still stationed on the Orenthi colonies, quietly training local doctors to take over treatments that had, until now, only ever been administered by human hands. There were the negotiators and technical advisors scattered across a dozen smaller worlds, each one holding together some fragile arrangement that had never made it into any official council record. None of these assignments had ever been forced on us. We had volunteered for every single one of them, over years of careful diplomacy, because it had seemed like the right way to prove ourselves worthy of a permanent seat at that table. I began to understand, reading through report after report that week, just how much of the galaxy's quiet stability depended on obligations nobody had ever bothered to write down. Nathan found me late one evening, going through yet another stack of recall confirmations, and he dropped into the seat across from me with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent all day fielding questions he was not allowed to answer honestly. "The Orenthi ambassador cornered me today," he said. "Asked me straight out whether the medical teams leaving meant humanity was abandoning our commitments to their colonies." "What did you tell him?" I asked. I told him the truth. I told him our commitments were made to a council that recognized us as equal members, and that council no longer exists in the form we agreed to serve. He didn't like that answer very much. "I imagine he didn't," I said. "He looked scared, Daniel. Not angry. Scared. Like he was only now realizing what losing us might actually mean for his people." That fear spread quickly once it took root. By the middle of the second week, private messages began arriving at the human section of the station, not through official council channels but through personal contacts that individual humans had built over years of working alongside individual aliens. A Doran engineer who had trained under one of our shipyard specialists sent a message asking, quietly and off the record, whether there was any way to convince the departing humans to stay just a little longer. An Orenthi medical administrator sent something similar, phrased with careful desperation, asking whether humanity's withdrawal truly had to include the disease prevention programs that had kept 3 outer colonies from suffering another outbreak. Grace Hollow gathered every one of these messages and read them without responding to a single one. I asked her once why she did not at least offer some comfort to the individual sending them, since none of them had personally voted against us. Because comfort right now would be a lie, she told me. Every one of those messages is coming from someone who benefited from our work, and never once used their voice to speak for us when it mattered. I understand their fear. I even feel some sympathy for it. But sympathy is not the same as forgetting who stayed silent when we needed allies in that chamber. I thought of Vesic then, the old Doran ambassador who had at least tried to warn me before the vote was finalized, who had shown something like genuine regret in his voice every time we spoke since. I asked Grace whether even he fell into that same category. Vesic voted with his conscience the only way his position allowed him to, she said. He spoke against the measure in private council sessions I have seen the transcripts of. But he still voted for it in public because his government told him to, and that is the same choice every other delegate made. Kindness in private does not undo a vote cast in public. It was a hard thing to accept, but I understood the logic of it even as it sat uncomfortably in my chest. This was not about individual cruelty. It was about an entire system that had decided humanity's usefulness no longer required humanity's equality, and every single delegate in that chamber had gone along with the decision, regardless of what private doubts they carried. The tension in the station grew sharper as more recall shuttles departed. I began to notice something in the way alien staff moved through the corridors, a kind of nervous energy that had not existed a month earlier. Maintenance requests that used to be routed automatically to human technical staff now sat unanswered for hours, because there was no longer anyone assigned to handle them. Supply shipments that had always moved through channels partly managed by human logistics officers began experiencing small, unexplained delays. None of it was catastrophic yet. It was the sort of friction that builds slowly, 100 small inconveniences piling on top of each other, until the people experiencing them start to wonder why everything suddenly feels harder than it used to. Sophie Marlowe, one of our senior engineers who had spent years maintaining critical systems on a Velkari research platform, came to see me the day before her own scheduled departure. She had a folder of technical reports she wanted logged with the delegation before she left, records of exactly which systems she had built, exactly which failsafes she had installed, and exactly how much of it depended on knowledge she had never fully documented for anyone outside her own small team. I asked her why she was being so thorough about it now, when she was simply following the same recall order everyone else had received. Because I wanted on record that we tried to warn them, she said. Every one of these systems has a note attached, explaining what happens if nobody trained in human engineering methods is available to maintain it. I'm not doing this to help them. I'm doing this so nobody can say afterward that we left them with no explanation at all. I filed her reports exactly as she asked, and I noticed, reading through them, a pattern that unsettled me more than anything the council itself had done. Sophie's systems were not unusual. Dozens of other human engineers across dozens of other alien platforms had built similar arrangements, quietly solving problems that alien engineering teams had struggled with for years, using methods and shortcuts that had never been shared outside small human working groups. It was not that humanity had been hoarding secrets out of malice. It was simply that we had solved problems faster than anyone expected, using approaches nobody else had thought to try, and in the rush to keep proving our usefulness, none of us had ever stopped to formally teach anyone else how we had done it. Now every one of those quiet, uncredited solutions was walking out the door at the same time, following a single calm order that had never once needed to raise its voice. By the final days of that second week, even the presiding officer of the council could no longer ignore what was happening. Ambassador Thessaline requested a private meeting with Grace Hollow, the first such request since the vote had passed. I was asked to attend as note-taker, and I watched the two women sit across from each other in a small conference room that suddenly felt far too quiet for the weight of what was being discussed. Thessaline began carefully, choosing her words the way someone chooses steps across unstable ground. We have noticed a significant increase in departures among your delegation and your citizens working across council territory, she said. I want to understand whether this is a coordinated response to the recent vote or simply an unrelated coincidence in timing. Grace did not hesitate. It is entirely coordinated, she said. We told the council we understood the decision that was made. We are simply acting on that understanding. Thessaline's composure slipped, just slightly, at the edges. And what exactly does that understanding involve? She asked. It involves humanity withdrawing from every arrangement that was never formally recognized as part of our charter obligations, Grace said. Every one of those arrangements was offered freely, as a gesture of good faith between equal partners. The Council has made clear that we are no longer considered equal partners. We are simply respecting that decision fully, rather than only in the parts that were convenient for the Council to keep. The room went very quiet after that. Thessaline looked, for the first time since I had known her, genuinely uncertain of what to say next. I watched her glance toward the door, as though she wished she could summon someone with better answers than the ones she currently had, and I realized, watching her in that moment, that the Council had made its decision without ever once considering what it might actually cost them to lose us. They were only beginning to find out. I did not understand the true scale of what we were withdrawing until I was called into a briefing that Command had scheduled with the senior members of our delegation, 3 weeks after the vote that started everything. Grace asked me to attend because I had been handling recall logistics longer than anyone else on the station, and because Command wanted someone present who understood exactly how many separate human operations were currently in motion across Council space. The briefing was led remotely by a woman named Claire Dutton, a systems coordinator working directly under Command back on Earth, and within the first few minutes of her presentation, I understood why every previous message from Command had been so carefully worded. "We are not simply pulling our people home," Claire began. "We are dismantling every uncredited system humanity has been quietly running on behalf of the Council for the better part of 2 decades. I want every one of you to understand exactly what that means, because once it is finished, there is no version of the galaxy that looks the same as it did a month ago." She began with the FTL relay network, a subject I had heard mentioned in passing dozens of times without ever grasping its full importance. Decades earlier, human engineers had built a series of relay stations in neutral space, connecting trade routes that the Council's own infrastructure had never managed to link efficiently. Officially, these relays belonged to no single government. Unofficially, they had been designed, built, and maintained almost entirely by human technical teams, using methods that had never been shared in full detail with any other species. Nearly 60% of all interstellar commerce moving through Council space currently depends on that relay network functioning correctly, Claire said. Most of it runs through systems that only a small number of human engineers fully understand. Those engineers have already been recalled. Maintenance on the network stopped as of yesterday. I felt the weight of that sentence settle over the room. Nathan, sitting beside me, let out a slow breath. 60%, he repeated quietly. That's not a disruption. That's collapse. Claire continued without pausing, moving on to the plague cure that human doctors had developed years earlier for the disease that had once devastated the Arenthi colonies. The cure had been distributed freely, at no cost, as a gesture meant to demonstrate humanity's good faith to the wider Council community. What had never been widely publicized was how dependent ongoing treatment remained on a continuous supply chain managed almost entirely by human pharmaceutical teams, using production methods that had never been fully transferred to Arenthi facilities. The colonies currently receiving treatment have perhaps 6 weeks of supply remaining at current distribution rates, Claire said. After that, without a change in circumstances, the disease returns to levels not seen in over a decade. I thought of Ethan Marsh, the young logistics officer who had asked what we were actually doing, while the rest of the delegation simply packed and left quietly. I understood now, listening to Claire's briefing, that the quiet departures had never been the entire plan. They had only been the visible surface of something far larger, something that had clearly been prepared for, long before that single word was ever sent in response to the vote. The final piece of Claire's briefing concerned the mercenary fleets, a subject that made even Grace Hollow lean forward with new attention. For years, independent human contractors, operating under private agreements rather than official Council sanction, had provided security and stabilization support along 3 separate border regions where tensions between rival species had repeatedly threatened to erupt into open conflict. These contractors were never officially acknowledged by the Council, which preferred to maintain the appearance that its own peacekeeping structures were sufficient to manage such disputes. The truth, Claire explained, was that those official structures had never actually been tested, because human contractors had quietly absorbed nearly every serious flashpoint before it could escalate into something the Council would have been forced to respond to directly. Those contracts have all been allowed to lapse, Claire said. Every human contractor currently operating in those border regions has been recalled home over the past 2 weeks. The Council does not yet know this, because none of those contracts were ever officially registered with council authority in the first place. They believed their own peacekeeping systems were keeping the peace. They will discover very soon exactly how much of that peace depended on quiet work nobody outside our own people ever properly acknowledged. I sat with that information for a long moment after the briefing ended, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what has been living underneath it the whole time. Humanity had never been hiding a weapon. We had never been building some hidden fleet meant to threaten the council into submission. Our response to betrayal was not aggression at all. It was simply the quiet, complete withdrawal of every unrecognized contribution we had ever made, all at once, delivered with the same calm patience we had shown in building those contributions in the first place. Grace addressed the room once Claire's briefing concluded, and her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her since the day the vote first passed. "I want every one of you to understand something clearly," she said. "We are not doing this out of spite. We are doing this because the council decided humanity's contributions were worth taking, without worth honoring. If they wanted the benefit of our work without the responsibility of treating us as equals, then they will now experience exactly what that arrangement actually costs them. We are not attacking anyone. We are simply stepping back from work we were never obligated to do in the first place, and allowing the council to manage the consequences of relying on labor they never officially recognized." Sophie Marlowe, still finishing her final recall preparations before her own departure, asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. "What happens when they realize what's happening?" she asked. "What happens when the relays go dark, and the medicine runs out, and the border conflicts start flaring up again all at the same time? Do we do anything to help, or do we let it run its course?" Grace did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch long enough that I understood she was choosing her words as carefully as she had ever chosen anything in her long career. "We let it run its course," she finally said, "not out of cruelty, but because there is no other way for the council to truly understand what they broke. If we step back in now to soften the impact, they will simply conclude they can take from us again in the future without consequence. The only way this lesson holds is if they feel the full weight of it, all at once, exactly the way we felt the full weight of that vote." I left that briefing with a strange mixture of pride and unease sitting side by side in my chest. Pride, because I finally understood the full scope of what my own species had quietly built and maintained across the stars, far more than any official record had ever credited us for. Unease, because I knew what was coming next, and I understood that once it began, there would be no way to control exactly how far the consequences would spread. 2 days after that briefing, the first relay station in the neutral trade corridor went silent, exactly on schedule, exactly as Claire Dutton had described. I was on shift at the communications desk when the first reports of disrupted trade routes began arriving, confused and scattered at first, the kind of reports that read like isolated technical failures rather than the beginning of something much larger. I read through each report carefully, and I thought of the calm single word that had started all of this. Understood. It had never been a word of surrender. It had been a word of patience, chosen by people who already knew exactly what they intended to do, and who were simply waiting for the rest of the galaxy to discover, piece by piece, exactly how much it had been depending on the quiet work of a species it had just decided was no longer worth treating fairly. The silence was ending. What came next would not be silent at all. The failures did not arrive all at once, and that made them worse, not better. Within 4 days of the first relay station going silent, trade routes across 3 major sectors began experiencing delays that grew from minor inconveniences into serious shortages. Cargo ships that had once passed through the neutral corridor without incident now found themselves rerouted along longer, slower paths, burning fuel and time that many smaller trading operations could not afford to lose. I watched the reports pile up on my desk, one after another, each one a little more urgent than the last, and I felt no satisfaction in reading them, only a heavy kind of clarity about exactly what we had chosen to allow. By the end of the first week, the Orenthi medical administrator who had once sent Grace a quiet, desperate message about the plague treatment program sent another. And this time, there was no careful diplomatic language in it at all. 2 of the outer colonies had reported new cases of the illness humanity's cure had once kept fully suppressed. The administrator was not angry in his message. He was afraid, in the plain and open way of someone watching a disaster unfold that he had no power to stop. Grace read that message in front of me without any visible reaction, though I noticed her hands stayed very still on the table for a long moment afterward. I asked her once, quietly, whether it was hard for her to read those messages and do nothing. "It is the hardest thing I have ever had to do," she admitted, "but I remind myself, every single time, that not one of those colonies spoke up for us when the vote was cast. Their silence bought them nothing, and neither will mine changing now." The border conflicts were the last piece to break, and when they did, they broke faster and louder than either the trade routes or the medical crisis had. Without the quiet presence of human contractors keeping the peace, two rival factions along one particularly volatile border region resumed hostilities within days, and this time, there was no independent force positioned to step between them before real damage was done. Council peacekeeping ships, untested and unprepared for a conflict they had always assumed someone else was quietly managing, arrived too late to prevent serious losses on both sides. It was this last failure, more than the relays or the medicine, that finally forced the council to act. An emergency session was called, the first such session since the vote that had started everything, and this time, every seat in the chamber was filled, every delegate present, every argument that had been simmering quietly for weeks, finally boiling over into open panic. I was not present for the opening of that session. I learned what happened from Nathan, who had been asked to observe on behalf of the delegation, since Grace herself had declined to attend in person. He described a chamber in complete disarray, delegates shouting over one another, demanding explanations from officials who had no answers to give, because none of them had ever understood how deeply their own systems depended on work quietly done by a species they had just voted to strip of its equal standing. Corvain, the Velkari representative who had championed the original vote against us, stood up in the middle of that chaos and demanded to know why nobody had warned the council about how much of their infrastructure relied on human labor. "Nobody warned you," Nathan told me later, "because nobody asked. You spent 40 years taking what we offered and calling it generosity, rather than partnership. You never once stopped to ask what would happen if that generosity stopped." By the time the session ended, the council had passed an emergency resolution requesting formal renewed contact with the human delegation, not to discuss trade or treaties, but simply to ask what it would take to convince humanity to resume its previous arrangements. Ambassador Thessaline herself sent the request, addressed directly to Grace Hollow, and copied to me, as the delegation's communications officer. Grace read the request twice before she spoke. "They want us to come back and fix what they broke," she said, without ever once admitting that what happened to us was wrong in the first place. She did not respond to the request immediately. Instead, she called command directly, a conversation I was permitted to sit in on only because I had handled every piece of correspondence related to the crisis from the very beginning. Laura Bennett was there too, and Nathan. And for the first time in weeks I saw something in Grace's expression that looked almost like relief, the relief of someone finally reaching the moment she had been quietly preparing for all along. Command's answer came back within the hour, and this time, it was not a single word. It was an instruction, delivered with the same calm patience that had defined every decision since the vote first passed. "Send Daniel Cole back to the chamber," the message read. "Let him deliver our full response, in person, exactly as instructed." I felt something tighten in my chest reading that. Grace looked at me across the table, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked like she was seeing me not as a junior officer, but as someone about to carry something far heavier than his rank had ever prepared him for. "They chose you because you were there for the vote," she said quietly. "It matters that the same face who watched them betray us is the same face who delivers our answer now." I returned to the council chamber 2 days later, and the change in atmosphere was impossible to miss the moment I stepped through those tall doors. The delegates who had once avoided my eyes now watched me with open, unguarded attention, the kind of attention people give someone they suddenly realize holds power over their future. Ambassador Thessaline rose to greet me personally, an honor she had never once extended during my years of prior service. "We are grateful you agreed to return," she began, her voice carrying a formality that could not quite hide the strain beneath it. "The Council recognizes that recent events have caused significant hardship across several member systems, and we are prepared to discuss a full restoration of humanity's previous standing, effective immediately." I let her finish before I spoke, because Command's instructions had been very specific about exactly what I was to say, and in exactly what order. "I appreciate the Council's willingness to speak with us again," I said. But I want to be clear about what I am here to deliver. I am not here to negotiate a restoration of anything. I am here to explain what happens next, and to make sure every delegate in this chamber understands it fully before we leave this room. The chamber went quiet in a way I recognized immediately. The same silence that had fallen the day the vote against us was first cast, except this time the silence belonged entirely to them. Humanity is willing to resume limited cooperation with any individual member species who formally requests it, I continued, and who is willing to negotiate that cooperation as an equal partnership, documented, credited, and fairly compensated, exactly the way any two equal parties would negotiate an agreement. We are not willing to resume the informal, uncredited arrangements that existed before the vote. Those arrangements only ever worked because we chose generosity over insistence on recognition. That generosity is no longer available to a council that demonstrated, in a single vote, exactly how little our contributions were worth to it once we stopped being convenient. Corvain rose from his seat, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. "And if we refuse those terms," he asked, "what then?" "Then nothing changes," I told him. "The relays stay dark. The medical supply chains remain interrupted. The border regions continue managing their own conflicts without the quiet support they never officially acknowledged receiving in the first place. Humanity is not demanding anything from you. We are simply no longer willing to provide, for free and without recognition, the exact contributions that this council decided were not worth honoring with equal standing." I watched something shift across that chamber as I spoke, delegate after delegate lowering their eyes, not in anger, but in the slow, uncomfortable recognition of exactly what they had done and exactly what it had cost them. Vesic, the old Doran ambassador, was the only one who did not look away. He met my eyes directly, and there was something like respect in his expression, mixed with a sorrow that had clearly been sitting with him since the day of the original vote. "You told us you understood," he said quietly, once the chamber had fallen fully silent. "I did not understand until now exactly what that word truly meant." "It meant exactly what it said," I told him. "We understood the decision the council made. We simply made sure the council would eventually understand it too." I left the chamber that day without waiting to hear the council's formal response, because Command's instructions had made clear that our position did not depend on winning their agreement. It depended only on holding steady, exactly as we had done from the very beginning, and allowing the consequences of their own choice to teach the lesson that no argument from us could ever have delivered as clearly. Weeks later, individual species began approaching us one at a time, quietly negotiating new agreements built on equal terms, properly documented, properly credited, properly compensated, in ways the old informal arrangements had never required. Humanity did not return to the council as the same quiet, endlessly generous partner it had once been. We returned as something the galaxy had never quite expected us to become, a species that had learned, through hard experience, exactly how much its own steady, patient reliability was worth, and exactly how firmly it now intended to insist on being valued for it. I think back often to that single-word command sent the day of the vote, and I understand now why it carried so much more weight than any speech ever could have. It was never meant as an argument. It was a promise, quietly kept, delivered exactly the way we said we would deliver it, without noise, without threats, without a single moment of hesitation once the decision had been made. The galaxy had spent 40 years underestimating exactly what that kind of quiet reliability could mean, both as a gift freely given, and as something that could just as easily, and just as calmly, be taken away. "Understood," I whispered to myself, standing once more at the window looking out over the stars, and for the first time since the vote that started everything, the word finally felt like it belonged entirely to us.